So I teach large classes, think 300 students in the same room at the same time. And at the beginning of the semester, there's always a lengthy queue of students coming down to talk to me about general questions they have for my course. There's always at least one student who comes down and asks me, "Hey professor, how do you take notes in your class?" Now I really struggle answering that question because one, I know the student really cares about doing well in the class, and two, they're really hoping for a simple answer. Like every time I scratch my nose, you should be copying down that word because it's going to be on the exam. But professors aren't catchers in baseball giving signs as to when and when you shouldn't be taking down notes. No! Professors tell stories and facts, and it's up to you to decipher what it is and is not relevant, what is and is not important for the exam. And in this video, I'll be giving you some key considerations that you should have when taking notes, not just down in my class, but in any of your classes. Here we go. Hey guys, I'm Mike. I'm an organizational behavior professor at the Ted Rogers School of Management. In weekly videos, I share my insights to give you a leg up when in university. I generally don't talk about topics learned in the classroom, but learn the hard way throughout university life. So if you are in uni or will be soon, hit subscribe, smash the like, and check out my weekly videos. In this week's video, I'll be talking about how you should be taking notes in your class. So before I jump into my tips, I want you to first ask yourself, why are you taking notes in the first place? And the answer obviously is, because I want to learn from you, professor. No! While maybe only 0.1 or 0.2% of my student population actually care about learning in my class, the vast majority of you just want to do well on exams. So, based on that logic, your note-taking should be driven for memory retention. Everything you do in terms of your note-taking should trigger your memory for recall during an exam to help you succeed on an exam. And memory retention is really important to me because ever since I entered my 30s, I lost three things. One, my metabolism, two, my memory, and three, my metabolism, memory, and the first thing you should consider when taking notes is whether you're using a computer or an old school pen and paper. In most of my classes, every single one of my students has a computer in front of them. They're Googling, they're taking notes, they're chatting with their friends on social media. As a professor, I probably should be saying, "Hey, close down those applications. They're distracting you and listen to my class." If those platforms existed when I was an undergrad, I'd be doing the exact same thing. Classes are boring. Computers are so beneficial for taking notes in so many different ways. One, it's easy to take notes on them. Two, things are always going to be legible. You can send them to your friends easy. You can save them in multiple places. You can edit them on the fly or after the fact. There's so many benefits in terms of taking notes on a computer. However, if you take notes with a pen, research suggests that taking notes via pen leads to greater memory retention. The rationale behind it is that it actually takes more effort to take notes via pen, and that effort translates into a greater memory retention. So I'm not saying to never take notes via computer. However, if you haven't ever taken a note via a pen, give it a shot. The next thing I want you to consider are acronyms. Now, every single one of my students should be able to tell you the benefits of using acronyms to memorize steps, processes, concepts, because I push them heavily on my students, particularly when it comes to memorizing processes for the exam. All that you have to do is take the list of items that you need to have memorized. And the first item on the list, take one of the words and encircle a key letter, typically the first letter of that word. That memorizing that letter should trigger your memory in terms of what that word is. Once you remember the word, it should trigger your memory in terms of what that entire sentence is that you're trying to have memorized. Simply take those letters that you've highlighted, string them together to form a word. Now, if you're lucky and those string together letters make a word that you can remember, it's easy to remember. Perfect. If not, it's still easier to memorize a license plate of letters rather than an entire paragraph to which that license plate represents. And the next thing I'd like to recommend is creating visuals for what you're hearing in class, because most people find it easier to recall visual over words. So I'm a visual guy, and anytime I hear somebody talking about something important and that I need to have memorized, I always try to sketch something out. I try to create a flow chart, some type of visual or figure or drawing, something that'll allow me to better understand what they're trying to say, because if I can capture what they're saying in words, in a figure, it's much easier for me to retain it in my head and also to describe it to others. And the picture doesn't even have to be that good, because the effort that goes into creating it and conceptualizing it is what's going to be triggering your memory later on down the road. The next recommendation is to ask. Ask the professor what is important and what should be covered down in your notes. But don't just say, hey professor, what's important? No, we don't like that. We make it sound like you're using the same line on every single person. So instead, you gotta try to make it a little bit more personal. Perhaps you could say something like, hi professor, I've been really struggling with note-taking over the past couple of years. Can you please give me some guidance to how to succeed in your class? But here's the pro tip. Always ask the professor before the class rather than after the class. If you ask them before the class, this might give them an additional nudge to overemphasize certain items that they know are going to be on the exam. And that extra emphasis will allow you to better identify the notes you should be taking. And that brings me to my next recommendation. My next recommendation is to compare your notes with other sources. Compare them to the textbook, compare them to the slides, compare them to your peers. Now, when you're comparing notes, look for similarities between what you had and what the textbook or what other people had. This will reflect general, big, overarching concepts that you got and were able to retain and write down during the class. But also look for differences, because if there are differences that you might have missed during the class, it suggests that one, you missed it, and two, you might not have got that concept during the class. But don't just scribble down that additional fact. No, think more critically as to what it was, why did you miss writing this down during the class? Did you just simply not have enough time? Or was there a concept that went over your head? So my next tip is to not overdo it. Don't spend your time writing every single word down. I had so many students head down writing the entire time, trying to capture every single word that I say. I appreciate the enthusiasm, but I'm not sure how much they're actually getting out of it. Remember, your notes are designed to trigger your memory. That'll help you later on in the exam. If words are going in one ear and then written on the page, I'm not sure they're creating a memory to re-jog later on. To put this into perspective, just think about who you are when you're traveling. Are you the kind of person that lives their entire trip behind the lens of a camera, documenting everything that's going on, worrying about color contrast and making sure all the objects are in the frame? Or are you the type of person that likes to live in the moment? When you're traveling, you want to fully embrace and experience where you are. Sure, you might take a couple of pictures here and there to re-jog your memory, to take you back how much fun you were having back then. The same premise occurs when you're in the classroom. Why are you in there? Are you in the classroom to document the class for somebody else? Or are you in the class to try to re-jog your memory for an exam so that you can get an A on the exam? All right, now I've saved my best tip for last, other than actually attending class or taking notes during class, and that is the memory summary. Quite simply, at the end of each class, write down a simple summary of what you've learned during the class. Now, this doesn't have to be long or complex. No, instead, you should be writing the summary as if you're trying to explain it to a 5-year-old. This will do two important things. First, it'll trigger a shift from short-term to long-term memory, because based on memory science, when you're trying to recall something at least 15 minutes after when you initially heard it, you're more likely to shift something to a long-term memory. And that's really what you want, because anything that's in your long-term memory, you're more likely to recall during an exam. The second key thing it'll do is, by keeping it simple, it'll also make sure that you get the concept. If you get the concept, you're more likely to remember it. And if you can't make it simple, don't worry. You should actually try yourself as becoming a professor, because we love making things sound more complicated than they need to be. All right, guys, that's it. That's my tips for how you should be taking notes during class. If you found this video helpful or want to hear more tips on how to make your student life more manageable, hit subscribe, smash the like, make sure the notification tab is on, and check out my videos next week. Until then.